thanks for joining. Delphine Joyeux and Stephen Conley here from the Corporate Governance Institute. Today, we are speaking with Gillian Harford of the 30% Club about gender diversity in boardrooms and the work of the 30% Club. Gillian Harford is the former head of HR strategy and planning with AIB, where she was responsible for people change with a particular focus on culture, career diversity, and agile work. She's currently the country executive for the 30% Club in Ireland, helping to build its future strategy. And she's also a member of the board of the Central Remedial Clinic in Dublin. You're very welcome, Gillian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you both.
Nice to meet you too. So, Gillian, let's dive into that. Why and when was the 30% Club founded?
The 30% Club started in 2010 in the UK, founded by an incredible woman, Helena Morrissey, now Dame Helena Morrissey. And Helena worked in the funds industry and realized that at many board meetings, she was the only woman there, and she was there as a guest, not even as a member of the board. So it led to conversations with some chairs of boards from the FTSE 100, and the 30% Club grew from there. Today, it operates in 19 chapters around the world. And there are more than 1,400 chairs or CEOs of some of the world's largest organizations counted as our supporters.
That's amazing. And when did the Irish chapter start?
So the Irish chapter started in 2015. So we were about 5 years behind, but still ahead of a number of the other chapters. But in 2015, Ireland was ready to move into that space. We'd seen the progress in the UK, and in Ireland in 2015, gender balance on the boards of the ISAC 20 stood at just 12%. So we knew at that point that there was definitely progress to be made in Ireland, and perhaps a good opportunity for the 30% Club to start here as well.
All right. So the goal in 2010 was to get a minimum of 30% women of the FTSE 100 by 2015. Was this achieved?
Yes, as close to that as is possible. I think it was in 2016. The FTSE 100 today now stands at 39%. So it's been really interesting to see that progress. So in Ireland, when we started in 2015, as I said, the ISAC 20 was at 12%, and our target was to reach 30% by 2020. So in March last year, we hit 31%. So a great reason to celebrate. So much done, but still lots more to do.
Excellent. Just before we dive a bit more into the Irish chapter, who and what companies are involved in the 30% Club?
Typically, in most of the chapters across the globe, it starts with companies that are listed on the local stock exchange. So, for example, in the UK, it would have started with the FTSE 100. It then would have extended beyond the FTSE 100, and across the world, that's what you would tend to see. So they would be household names across all sectors. And then in Ireland, when we started to look at it in 2015, we decided if we focused only on listed companies, it would be quite a small number of members and would cover quite a small number of the population of the workforce. So Ireland was the first chapter to extend beyond listed companies, and we invited in state, semi-state, large private, and also in Ireland we've such a strong multinational presence. So we were the first chapter to go beyond listed organizations and focus really on the size of the company And we're now starting to see that spread across some of the other chapters as well.
Yeah, very good. It's great progress we made. In the early days, Gillian, what was the reaction to the 30% club from people in, for example, C-suite or board positions?
It probably, if I'm really honest, it probably fell into three categories. There was an immediate group of chairs and CEOs that were advocates from day one. And luckily that continues to be the majority of our supporters. Chairs and CEOs who were really starting to see that this was going to make a huge difference to their business. And that's the underlying message within the 30% club. Gender balance is good for business. And that's why we follow the strategies that we do. There was probably a group in the middle that were kind of saying, well, if everybody else is doing it, why aren't we doing it? And getting their companies involved on that basis. And then there's a third group, a very small group that are kind of going, oh, well, if I'm not in, what does it look like if I'm not in? But I would have to say the majority of our supporters started on the basis of, yes, this makes sense, and we want to be advocates from the outset, which was really important to us. And it's easy for me to say this as a HR person, but in 2015 in Ireland, most of the groups lobbying for diversity were people like me. We were HR people saying, this is what we need for talent, this is what we need in terms of employee engagement. But actually, that's not where change happens. Change happens at the CEO level and at the board level. And that's what made the 30% club unique at the time, and probably still makes it unique. It's about business leaders at the very top. So about 80% of our supporters are male, which is quite unusual in terms of a group, particularly a business group, that's driving change in terms of gender balance.
That's very interesting, Gillian. And you said a word, you said the word lobby. So would you describe the 30% club as a campaign of influence? And how does it work in practice?
Yes, so and it's funny because we're described as a club. So every week I get lots of women sending me a message going, can we join the club and can we get on the mailing list? But it's probably better to describe us as a campaign. And definitely, and I like the way you've described it, Delphine, a campaign of influence. So our vision is very clear. And in fact, our vision has crystallized in the last 2 or 3 years. Originally, we were just focusing on boards. Now we focus on boards and C-suite. So our vision is 30% gender balance on a global basis in terms of board and C-suite. And all our work falls into 3 categories. So the first is around activating the most important audience, who are the chairs and CEOs. Our second pillar is around focusing on how we can influence at a national level. And once we influence at a national level, how can we also contribute at a global level? But at national level is where we really want to partner with groups like the FTSE. In Ireland, we're part of Balance for Better Business, which is the government-backed initiative. But how do we use our voice? So in Ireland, for example, we now have 282 of Ireland's largest employers supporting us. That's almost 700,000 employees. So that gives us a strong voice in terms of speaking at national level, talking to government, getting involved and influencing in terms of policy. And our third area is around how do we help drive the talent pipeline? So how do we get programs around encouraging more women to step up for board roles, connecting them with board opportunities? And then in terms of middle management and senior management, we have a very strong mentoring program in each of our chapters. And we also work with universities offering women scholarships for executive education, because again, executive education is very tied to C-suite progress, which ultimately leads to board progress.
Yeah, very good. And you say that, you know, the 30% is a target, it's not a quota. What does this mean, and why is this such an important distinction?
I know sometimes when I'm out with different groups, we can get down to semantics very quickly, and they'll say to me, but sure, there's no difference between a target and a quota. And in some ways, it is a little bit of semantics. So within the 30% club, we look at quotas as being something that's forcibly applied to organizations, where there are significant consequences for failure, where instead we like to talk about the concept of targets, which are voluntary, which you step up to yourself as an organization, and you take accountability for progress. And when you operate in that way, targets can grow and move and stretch, whereas quotas tend to be a cap that once achieved, everything stops. So if we look at a national level, for example, countries like Ireland and the UK, countries like Australia, they've gone on the basis of voluntary targets, where organizations have stepped up themselves and said, this is what we're going to do. If you look at countries like Norway, like France, they've applied quotas at a national level, where there are significant consequences for failure. They've met the quota, but they've never pushed beyond it. And we haven't seen the progress on quotas extending into other areas. So in Norway, for example, one of the first European countries to set a quota for board level, and you had to meet that quota or delist. A number of Norwegian companies delisted rather than try to meet the quota. In fact, the number of listed companies dropped by almost 40%. And while Norway has met its quota for boards, it hasn't made any progress in terms of C-suite and in terms of female CEOs. Whereas we would be more on the basis that when organizations set it themselves, a target becomes a starting point rather than a ceiling, whereas a quota can become a ceiling that doesn't drive progress that's more sustainable in the long run. So that's how we tend to describe the difference. For me, I suppose the advantage is whether it's a target or a quota, they are still focused on progress. They are still focused on where are we, where do we need to be, and are we tracking? And in everything in business, what gets measured gets done. But we do believe that quotas are where you go when everything else has failed, and targets are much more beneficial in terms of accountability and sustainability.
That's fascinating. I was really waiting for this answer, this distinction between quota and a target. I really liked it. Yeah.
Yes.
Owning the change.
Yeah. Sometimes when I'm out with groups and they say this is really semantics, and I bring it home to a very practical example. So you can keep this in or you can cut this out, as Graham Norton would say. I describe it as a little bit like when you're encouraging your children to eat their vegetables. And say to them, you cannot leave the table until the carrots are eaten. And the child will do everything. They will hide the carrot. They will cut it into 10 different pieces. You will force them to eat the carrots, but it doesn't create a love of vegetables. Or you can say to the child, vegetables are really interesting. Carrots are really tasty. They're good for you. I'm going to encourage you to eat them. And you hope that they eat the carrots and then they'll move on and eat other vegetables as well. So we can force people to do things, or we can encourage them to see that this really makes sense, and hope that they will then start to work on it themselves.
So now, Gillian, let's talk about the difference it makes when there are more women at the C level. So, for example, it seems that companies with more than 30% women executives are more likely to outperform companies where this percentage range from 10 to 30. Why is that? Can you explain?
I don't know if I can explain it, so I do have some colleagues in the 30% Club who talk about causation and correlation, but the reality of it is that when you have greater gender balance, both at the board and the C-suite, you are more likely to outperform your peers. And a number of areas of interest have come through in this space. So it tends to be linked to a more balanced risk appetite, a more balanced focus on governance, a more balanced focus on consideration of impacts on key groups. So for example, the evidence would suggest that if you have more balanced leadership team, you'll get more balanced thinking in terms of innovation and customer solutions, which translates into profitability, because obviously your customer base is more balanced. So when we think about in the consumer world, for example, we know that at least 80% of consumer decisions are either made or heavily influenced by women. And organizations where product innovation is developed by gender non-balanced teams as opposed to gender balanced teams end up with better reverse that back. So when your product innovation has less gender balance, the outcomes have less gender balance in terms of customer solution. So if you can get that right, then you get better customer solutions, you get better employee solutions, and you get better stakeholder solutions because you have diversity of thought. But again, it has to be diversity of thought, not just on a gender basis. So within the 30% Club, when we talk about better gender balance, we don't talk about one particular type of woman. We talk about all women in terms of women of different backgrounds, different social class, different ethnic origin, different sexual orientation, because there's no point bringing women on the board or into the C-suite if they have exactly the same background and exactly the same representation as the group that are already there. Women make up just over 50% of the population, but all women give a better balance in terms of diversity of thought, in the same way as all men can give a better balance in terms of diversity of thought.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for this, putting some light about what could a better gender balance can bring on the executive level, and what is it on the board level. I guess it's a bit of the same. You talk about risk appetite, but would you tell us a little bit about women overseeing the policies, in the board? What impact could that have?
Well, actually, it's interesting that at board level, there's another dimension that comes on board to talk about boards. What we're starting to see coming forward, and there's some interesting research coming out of California in this space, that because women tend to be centered in different functions at executive level to men, that by virtue of bringing more women on your board, you are bringing in more specialist functions onto the board. So by virtue of a board saying we would like a better gender balance, and we're going to spread our net in terms of the types of candidates that we would bring onto the board, we're starting to see HR executives, sustainability executives, marketing executives now coming in to fill in board roles. Previously, we would have had boards that would have said, we are overseeing an organization where our people are at the heart of our business, but there mightn't necessarily be a HR or a transformation expert on the board. Now, by virtue of trying to look for gender balance, we are seeing more HR executives going onto boards. We are seeing more sustainability experts going onto boards. So that's actually broadening out the view and perspective on policies, on decisions. You tend to see a greater balance on the board in terms of consumer expertise or customer representation. So literally by virtue of trying to expand gender balance, the boards are also bringing in better sector expertise, because again, with the advantage of filling out a board seat compared to filling out a C-suite, you can go to different industries. Whereas typically if you're trying to fill within the C-suite, you will look within your own industry. At board level, you now go broader. So we're seeing, as I said, as boards, whether it's through the chair or the board secretary or the nominations committees, by virtue of trying to look at a more balanced slate, they are now going beyond typical industries and typical roles in terms of finding strong candidates.
Thank you, Gillian. And I'll have another question reminding what you said at the beginning, that the actual audience of the 30% Club is more chairs and CEOs. What can they do to support the 30% Club in a practical sense?
Oh, in a practical sense, it's very easy. And we're very clear in terms of what we ask them to do. So the first thing we ask them to do is talk about it. Because if it becomes part of the business conversation, it becomes part of the business action. So that's the first thing we ask of any of our new chair or CEO supporters coming on board. We then ask them to seriously consider setting targets within their own organization if they don't already have them. And we then ask them to have an action plan. So an action plan at board level, an action plan then at C-suite level, and finally an action plan in terms of senior management so that the pipeline can continue. And where an organization focuses at that level, you start to see change. So diversity starts to become a discussion item on the board agenda. It starts to become a discussion item on the business agenda, and not just by the HR executive, but a discussion item in terms of procurement, in terms of supply chain, in terms of customer, in terms of brand. And that's where CEOs and chairs really start to change the agenda and influence beyond just representation, but really how do we start to integrate a more balanced thinking across everything we do within the business strategy, which ultimately drives business results.
Yeah, very good. I mean, we touched on it earlier, and Gillian, and if you look across various sectors, some are still very male dominated. In the early days, were there sectors that showed the most resistance, and are there sectors today that are still resistant to the campaign of influence that the 30% Club has?
I think we've been very lucky within Ireland that there haven't actually been any sectors that have been resistant. Some of my colleagues in some of the other chapters around the world have probably had slightly more in terms of resistors than we would have had. I think what we found in Ireland in 2015, and I would have got involved as a volunteer in 2015 through my previous organization, we had some sectors that were very ready to jump ahead. So for example, the financial services sector in 2015 was very ready because it was a really good step for the industry, particularly coming out of the post-Celtic Tiger era, and where financial services were trying to look at building a new culture and a new focus going forward. So we had at the time, and we still have, a very strong membership within the financial services sector, the same within the professional services firms. Again, a very strong realization of the importance of gender balance in terms of client engagement and client expectations. Some of the other sectors were probably a little bit slower, not because of resistance, but more on the basis that they had a bigger route to climb. Like if you take financial services, for example, 56% of financial services roles are held by women. So there was already a strong population, but I now work with industries and groups where they don't have that advantage. So it's not that they were resistant, it's more that they had a bigger journey to go on. And we're now starting to see smaller companies wanting to get on board, even though they mightn't have the same level of formality in terms of HR structures or diversity specialists, but they're competing in a market where their peers are talking about gender balance and talking about better opportunities. So we now see it spreading into industries who maybe weren't ready in 2015, but now are. And actually within the 30% Club in Ireland, we now have 6 industry groups that cut across food and drink, pharma, technology, financial services, professional services, and public services, because we're starting to see different industries might have slightly different needs within the overall umbrella of the 30% Club, but something that's quite specific to where they're at and where they need to be. So really lucky in terms of the spread of members that we have, and a genuine spirit of collaboration in terms of marketing Ireland as a diverse employment opportunity in terms of gender, but also in the broader sense of diversity.
I just have one question. You mentioned Celtic Tiger. Can you, I don't know what that is. Can you explain?
Oh gosh, that's a very Irish phenomenon. So the Celtic Tiger, I'd probably describe it as a period of economic and commercial expansion that was followed by a period of economic and commercial setbacks, which left a lot of Irish companies focusing on so many other things. People say to me, why didn't the 30% Club come to Ireland in 2010? In Ireland in 2010, we were so focused on economic survival and starting to build on economic recovery. By 2015, we were ready to see how a different business culture, a more balanced business culture, might ensure more stability in terms of economic progress in Ireland going forward.
Thank you, Gillian. If there are some for all the non-Irish viewers, that might help as well. So, well, I have a last question, Gillian. You spoke a lot about the past, the present, and about the future. What is the current ambition for the 30% Club?
Yeah, our ambition is still 30% on a global basis. It's really interesting. The UK have had this question, Australia, and now ourselves in Ireland, saying, well, now you've reached 30% on your listed boards, what's next? So our vision is still, we want 30% minimum in every boardroom and every C-suite on a global basis. Deloitte recently produced their global D&I report. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it showed that on a global basis, just under 20% of board positions across the globe are held by women. So while there's been progress in lots of countries, there are others where progress still needs to be made. So for us, we're still going on the basis that our vision is a minimum of 30%, because 30% is where a minority can have an influencing voice. So 30% at board, 30% at C-suite in all organizations, and then also a focus on how do we make sure that there is balance in the key roles? So even on the FTSE 100, where the overall numbers at board level are almost at 40%, we still see a dearth in terms of female chairs, female CEOs, female CFOs. So yes, we want to have balance, but we also want to have balanced representation around the most senior roles of influence and then back into the pipeline. So still lots more to be done.
Gillian, thank you so much for this interview discussion. I would say even more than interview. It's been really interesting, and I find it's challenging at the same time, you know, but it's a good challenge that we want to own this responsibility and to see. I understand that after women on board, it's also what roles can those women on board held in the boardroom, you know, so we are still, so I understand that we are, the more we advance, the more we have other challenges, the more challenges we have, you know.
Yes,
so,
or the more opportunities we have to make progress.